Conflict resolution in the astrological world is understanding how someone else's astrology works and what they're bringing to the table, and how that's going to interact with what you're bringing to the table.
Know that these behaviors typically manifest during conflict, and be mindful of them, be aware, and work actively against them.
Hello and welcome to Full Circle, the Magic Mindset Podcast. I am Leah Lilly, one of your hosts, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host and amazing friend, Matt Carlberg. We aim to bridge the gap between my study of astrology and Matt's study of psychology and sociology. Each week, we discuss a specific theme and approach it from two different perspectives to come to a deeper understanding from both an astrological and psychological perspective.
If you missed out on any of our previous episodes, you can catch up at leahlilly.com/fullcirclepodcast or on Spotify and iTunes by searching for Full Circle Podcast. I am really excited about this week's theme for two reasons. One, it applies to literally everyone, meaning we can all share our own experiences and we can learn from each other, which is great. And two, it lets me use my organizational communications degree, which is such a small part of the podcast that it doesn't even get mentioned in the intro, but it was probably my favorite part of my degree program. Last week, Leah and I shared a little snippet from our long and storied relationship. And I would like to think that we've gotten a little better at dealing with our problems. Part of that is due to us growing as people, and part of it is us being comfortable being open and honest with each other. Regardless, we'd like to use some of that energy from last week to segue into the theme for the next 2 weeks, which is conflict resolution.
All right, you ready for this astro update?
Yeah, give it to me.
This week in astrology, we are seeing a couple of different things happening. But the first thing I want to talk to you about is seasonal change. The change in season is definitely upon us. I don't know about all of you, but I've noticed the golden autumn light in the evenings, a definite chill in the air, and some beautiful leaves changing. Seasonal change can be truly difficult as we leave the long, warm days of summer behind and begin to prepare for the chill and darkness of winter. And some people hear those two things and cringe, and I don't blame you. They take some definite preparing for. So I encourage you to soak up the moments of sun on your skin, find joy in transitioning from your summer to fall wardrobe, and begin to prepare your cave with joy as you fill it with things that make you feel light and happy. Use the last week of Libra season to prepare your space for winter. If you remember, one of the qualities of Libra is beauty, so indulging in fall traditions like cider, haunted houses, pumpkin carving to keep your spirit happy and kind of indulge in that beauty of the season. Seasonal change affects us all differently, but if you find ways to embrace it instead of hating on it or avoiding it, you'll make that transition much easier for yourself. Combined with Mercury in Scorpio, which focuses on learning and acquiring knowledge, we're being pushed to explore our internal relationship with ourselves. Libra season has been a time of social energy among its other qualities, but right now we may be feeling a little bit more internal during a season that encourages us to look at our relationships. One of the most important relationships we often forget about is the one we have with ourselves. Maybe you've been feeling super social over the past few weeks, and now we're suddenly feeling this kind of slowdown in your energy and in being around others. Maybe you feel a little bit drained. Know that this is completely normal, and it's time to start spending time with and nurturing you before the holidays hit.
It's so interesting to talk about seasonal change because I don't usually have any issues moving from summer to fall, fall to winter, winter to spring. But I do have a hard time with like spring to summer. In the Midwest, sometimes it feels like winter to summer, like there's no real spring season. But I love fall so much that it must make that change easier for me. And it's definitely one of the things that I miss the most about not being in the States is not getting to experience fall and feel that season the way I'm used to it.
Yeah, I think there's so many wonderful things about fall, and we want all of the good stuff that comes along with fall, but we sometimes, I think, ignore the like deeper things, like that fall is a transition. It is shedding of stuff that no longer serves us, and that can be really hard to do. And I think we sometimes glaze over that, and then we get to winter and we're stuck with all of this dead weight that we didn't sort of slowly let fall encourage us to let fall away, like the leaves on the trees fall away. So how I always wonder how we can take those things that we love so much about fall and also let them kind of heal us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to think about it that I hadn't really considered. Is there is kind of that natural, like spring cleaning. Now we're done hibernating for the winter. We're going to get ready for the rest of the year, and then fall is like, okay, cool. Let's prep for that potentially like low energy winter and just be as mentally prepared for that as we can. It's interesting. I think there's probably some episodes in there somewhere that we can talk about in the future.
Yeah, just reaching new levels of depth. And it can be uncomfortable to go to those new levels, but by doing that, like you said, you're better mentally prepared, and that's half the battle, really. Yesterday, on October 13th, we saw a full moon in Aries, which brought intensity, fire, passion, and new experiences into our emotional field. This moon asked us, who do you want to be? And how do you want to reinvent yourself? It's time to break free and live freely. What are you passionate about? And how can you do more of that? Open up, speak your truth, do you, connect with your inner child, and play. When intensity comes up, we often pair that with seriousness. But how can you meet it like a child, and how can you get creative? Whatever came up for you yesterday or is coming up for you today or tomorrow, treat it with fun and creativity rather than your adult brain. The sun is approaching Scorpio, where Venus and Mercury are hanging out next week, and Scorpio season is coming on the 23rd. Enjoy the last few days of Libra season, plan your social interactions wisely, and take care of yourself.
In the spirit of conflict resolution, I was wondering over the last week, we haven't talked as much over the last week. You were traveling. What do you think was the last big fight that you were in?
Funnily enough, I think it was when we were recording last week's episode.
Oh, okay.
I think it was between you and I.
That's good. I wonder what in your mind, what was the argument about?
We have different levels of depth that we are willing to dive into on our podcast. And both of us have obviously different opinions about where we should be depth-wise. And finding out where we were both comfortable led to a little bit of friction between us.
And I think to define it, when we talk about depth, we're talking about the look inside of our personal lives that we're willing to do on the podcast, right? How much of ourselves and kind of those personal aspects of our life that we're willing to share.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you think caused the argument? I mean, obviously, like differing opinions caused the argument, but we were both passionate, and I think we took twice as long to record the episode as we usually do. And I think I spent 5 times as long editing the cut. What do you think caused that level of passion?
I think it was both of us being on complete opposite sides of a spectrum. Of me being more toward the end of I'm willing to share any and everything because I think it will serve a purpose, and your end of maybe people don't need to know that deeply and it can still be helpful without revealing all of my personal details. And us needing to find a middle ground to operate at, because we both wanted to operate where we were on the spectrum, and that wasn't going to satisfy you or I. So it's like, okay, we need to find a new common space that makes us both comfortable now.
Two things come to mind. One, on what you were saying, there's a phrase, and I won't get it exactly right, but it's like a good compromise leaves both parties unhappy, which I don't think is 100% true, but it's, I don't know, topical at least. And two, I think it's not specific to that episode. I think it's more generalized across all the episodes, where I feel that we can get a good message across, and I don't need to maybe air my dirty laundry the way that we aired our 10-year-old emails. And I think from your perspective, it becomes a lot more tangible when we share those personal experiences. And I think that we'll see growth in both of those areas within the podcast here.
Yeah. And I think, to your point and to where you are coming from and sitting with it as long as it's been, I think there is a lot for me to learn from your perspective too. And you have this really brilliant way of being able to summarize some of the depths to which I am comfortable explaining to you. And you've done that in our friendship just in general. And that lends itself really well to what we've created here and to my understanding of what I'm going through, actually putting words to it. And that sometimes we want to linger in the feeling and the depth and that this is what happened and this was the situation and these are all the details, when really we need to be figuring out, okay, but what am I taking from that? And in that way, I feel like when we come to those places, we really complement each other, even though it feels uncomfortable. And even though conflict sort of pops up as a result of that, it's ultimately this really beautiful learning experience for me.
That summarization, the breaking it down to individual points, comes from, I have a very short attention span, Leah. I don't know if you know that about me, but I do. But I think it's really valuable. It's valuable for both of us to have those experiences, and the fact that we can make that conflict healthy, I think is the important part. And this is, we're bleeding into week 2 content here a little bit, talking about our personal conflicts, I guess, but it is what I believe is going to improve the podcast the most in the long term, is you and I approaching from two sometimes completely different perspectives, and then finding some middle ground that marries the two and really hopefully creates something better. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It's another little phrase for you.
And don't get us wrong, y'all. It's hard to do, but we figure it out and we do it. It's hard, but we do it. This week's featured business is High Vibe Healing Gems.
Owner Carly began the business 3 years ago and has continued to provide a variety of amazing, high-quality goods, including gemstone jewelry and mala beads. You can use code 5OFF50, that's number 5 off, number 50, for $5 off your purchase of $50 or more.
If you're looking to learn more about crystals, introduce crystals into your life, or just generally have them around, this is the place to get them. Visit her on Etsy and social media now through the links in our show notes.
I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast that one of the reasons I'm excited about this theme is that I get to use the organizational communications part of my degree program, which we haven't done that much on the podcast thus far. We spent a long time talking about conflict, primarily about conflict in the workplace, but I think most of the things that we discussed could easily be applied to your personal life as well. And we'll get to some of that material in just a minute, but I want to start with kind of a basic sense approach to solving conflict, and then we'll jump into the org com stuff in a little bit. So I'm going to source this from Susan Heitler, who is a clinical psychologist, but like I said, it's really more basic sense. The general approach to conflict resolution is 3 steps. First, We have to recognize that there's a problem. This is going to require some emotional intelligence to allow you to look inward and understand your own feelings, which for some of us, including myself, is harder than for others. After that, we have to understand the underlying concerns. Are we upset about a problem, or are we upset about a symptom of the problem? And once we know that, then we can work with the other person or the other people to create a mutually agreeable solution, reaching a compromise of some sort. So with that in mind, OrgCom gives us John Gottman's theory, law, concept of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which is well known in the lore universe, mythology universe, but he applies it in a little bit of a different way here. So the four horsemen of the apocalypse from a conflict resolution perspective are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. So we'll talk about each of those individually here. Criticism is implying that there is something wrong with the person you have conflict with, typically demonstrated by using absolutes like you always and you never. It's really tough to use that type of statement in an argument, one, because it's almost never true, right? Like there are always exceptions to rules. And it's also really tough because it's not an effective communication tool, because it makes it very easy for the other person to completely discount what you're saying. If you say you always do this, they're like, I don't always do that. But if you say a specific example of a time where they did a behavior, it's a lot harder to just discount that offhand. Contempt is the next one, which is any statement that puts you on a higher ground than your partner. The way I typically think of this is when you act childish during an argument. It can be things like mocking, name calling, eye rolling. The idea is that I'm telling you I'm more important than you. That's why I'm right in this conflict. And it makes it really, really hard to move towards a solution. Third is defensiveness. This is one that I catch myself doing a lot. And the idea here is either you're going to play the victim, or, and this is where I really get in trouble with it, you defend from a perceived attack. So it's important to understand that both parties are entering the conflict, at least in most cases, from some sort of goodwill, right? We only engage in conflict to make it better, right? Otherwise, we just forget about it and move on. But if the relationship is important and we want to fix whatever the problem is, we're entering it from a place of goodwill. So I should never be feeling attacked. And if I do feel attacked, there are ways to address that. But the idea is here that I would lash out because I feel as though I'm being attacked for something. And again, it makes it very hard to move forward and make progress on the conflict. The last of the four horsemen of the apocalypse is stonewalling. This is when you withdraw from the conversation and you appear uninterested. Typically, this is men doing this. 80% of stonewallers are men. But I think that the important thing to understand here is the most common motivation for stonewalling isn't that you don't care. It's that you're overwhelmed and you need that time to withdraw into yourself and recover and calm down so that you can come back to the conversation. The reason that this is one of the horsemen is, one, if you're not participating in the conversation, it becomes very difficult to move towards a mutually agreeable solution. And two, it can always appear to the other person as though you are uninterested or not willing to work towards a solution, which indicates the relationship is less important to you than it is to them.
So, at the base, at the root of all this, I love that you mentioned that we have to recognize there's a problem. And that's when sort of these like four horsemen come up. But the first seed of it is recognizing there's a problem. And I think both people have to recognize that there's a problem. Would you agree?
I do agree, but I think that there are a couple ways to get there. I don't think that you need to recognize there's a problem independently, but I think that there does need to be a conversation that says, hey, here's what I'm feeling. Here's why I want to talk about it. And once the other person acknowledges the fact, like, okay, you're coming to me with a perceived issue, even if I don't feel that there's an issue, I need to understand that before we can move forward to the next step, which is underlying concerns
Yeah.
and figuring out what the problem actually is.
Right, right. So, and then you mentioned the symptoms of the problem, and sometimes we are approaching the symptoms rather than the problem itself. What's an example of a symptom of a problem that you might be able to give us?
It's an excellent question, and I'll try to think on it more for next week. I don't think I have a good example offhand, but I think the way to think about it is if I am coming to you and saying, hey, this specific thing that happened bothered me. So maybe if we use the conversation that we had earlier about the podcast, if I come to you and I say, hey, I feel like you didn't value my opinion when we were talking about how much of my personal life I want to share on the podcast. That's talking about a specific time or instance that a behavior occurred, right? So that would be a symptom like, hey, I want to fix this specific thing. And in this case, it's not true when we dig deeper that there is no underlying problem. We've got that reasonably well solved at this point, but the underlying problem could be, hey, I don't feel like you respect my opinions in, this adventure that we're taking together. Or I don't feel like you hear my opinions, or, you don't care, or that type of thing. The underlying problem there is the way that you're approaching my feelings and opinions, whereas the symptom is how that problem manifests, which is the specific argument that we talked about.
And these four horsemen you mentioned, they sound scary.
Yes.
We want to be careful of them. We want to watch out for these things. Like, what do you think the symbolism behind like four horsemen is here?
It's another excellent question. They are scary. To me, it's more about know that these behaviors typically manifest during conflict and be mindful of them, be aware, and work actively against them. The reason it's called the four horsemen of the apocalypse is, from a lore perspective, when the four horsemen ride down, it means the apocalypse is happening, right? And in the theory from Gottman, the idea is that when these things are manifesting in your conflict, the relationship is nearing an end, or it's at least going to have an explosive fight in the middle, right? Because you can't move towards progress. And if you don't move towards progress, negative feelings continue to manifest. And if you don't address them, that's when, you run into the explosive fights that we talked about in the Changing Friendships episode. And it's also, when we get me as the accidental ghoster. So the symbolism here is that these four horsemen, if they manifest consistently, can show that your relationship is ending.
So I imagine each of these four horsemen has a different strength or power. And I want to know what my strength or power in fighting against them is in each of these specific instances that you mentioned.
First off, I appreciate the commitment to the bit here, the whole idea of fighting them off. I appreciate your commitment to the part there. I think with going in order here, the best kind of one bullet strategy that you can use in your tool belt, in your quiver, I don't know. For criticism, I think it is partially I statements, which is something that you had talked about previously when we were prepping for this episode. But I think beyond that, it's the idea that we are implying that something is wrong with the other person. And when we are trying to fix these relationships, it is not beneficial to tear the other person down. And so I think using I statements and trying to keep your statements factual and not opinionated. For contempt, which, as a reminder, is trying to put ourselves on a higher ground than our partner, I think in this case, it's just using maturity. Honestly, I don't know that there's just like a one-stop trick for this one. But if you're to the point where you are name calling and rolling your eyes at your partner and mocking them, it might be time to call a quick timeout, take a couple minutes to yourself and reset, and then reapproach the conversation from there.
I would also say dropping into empathy might be helpful there too, to just understand how somebody else might be hurting as an effect of what you're saying and trying to understand that on your end.
Sure. And I think the reason that I don't mention empathy is because it is a skill and everybody has it to some degree, but for some people it's not a strength. And so taking that extra couple of minutes allows us to reset and cool off a little bit. But I would say absolutely, if you're a high empathy person, you can definitely use that effectively to not run into the contempt horseman. For defensiveness, and we mentioned this while I was explaining it originally, I think it's important to just remember the mentality that we're both here for the good of the relationship. I think if I were to put it into a communication tip for something that you can say, I think, again, we can share those feelings, right? Like, hey, when you say this, my perception of that statement is this. If it were me, I would prefer to analyze that within myself and say, hey, they aren't saying this to attack me. They're saying this from a point of bettering their relationship. But I think if you feel the need to say something, or if it's happening consistently that you're feeling defensive, I think then, you have the ability to come in and say, my perception of this type of statement is this. In the future, can we move forward in this route instead? And then for stonewalling, again, I think it's perfectly acceptable. Everybody understands that conflict is difficult. So I think it's perfectly acceptable for you to say, this conversation is important to me. I want to continue to have it, but right at this moment, I need to take, 2, 3, 5 minutes to, just calm down and think about it. Can we revisit this topic soon? I think the keys here are make sure that they understand that you're not trying to write off the concern. Make sure that they understand that the conversation is important, and make sure that they understand that you want to come right back to it so that then they can take some time to think, you can take some time to think, and you can come back and hopefully have a more constructive conversation.
I really like that you brought up the four horsemen because I think it puts into context a lot of what we see in conflicts and how people react in conflict. And when you look at that in addition to and next to astrology, I've seen astrology resolve a lot of conflict that stems from these four horsemen and some of what Matt has talked about. And both in my personal life and just in conflicts around me in doing work with natal charts and working with different people in different situations. Conflicts in my own life that have been going on for years, sort of applying astrology over understanding now these four horsemen to get a better idea of where these things are stemming from in my family, in my siblings, in my interactions with my friends. And it's provided a lot of healing to understand the source from which that comes from. So similar to what Matt was talking about of there being sort of a problem that sometimes is clouded with symptoms of the problem, these four horsemen that come up to me are symptoms of getting to that problem. And I can see that in every natal chart I've worked with. I can see where the problems stem from in relationships, with families, with your children, with your friends. It is all very apparent in looking at some of the astrology of it. And one of the places to start, if you've never even approached it or want to look at it, on your own end, is looking at Mars. Because Mars is our understanding of how people assert themselves, where their anger comes from, where their ability to say, no, this is how I'm feeling, this is what I want, this is what I'm after, this is my goal. And to give you a little bit of context and an example, Matt has Mars in Aries. And we've talked about this on previous episodes before, but Mars is exalted or happy in Aries. It's its natural place to be, which means that Matt is assertive and is happy to put out there, this is what I want, this is what I'm after, this is what I'm going for, this is what my goal is. Versus me, my Mars is in Libra, and Mars is not exalted there because it is on the opposite end of the horoscope wheel. So it's harder for me to be assertive. It's harder for me to put stuff out there, say, this is what I'm after, this is what I'm going for. I weigh it and decide when the right moment to put it out there is. And sometimes I wait until a situation really pushes me to be like, okay, this is how I'm feeling. This is what's going on. It's kind of more of an explosion, which relates back to our episode last week of talking about friendship and explosive endings of friendships. That's also where this stems from for me. To me, conflict resolution in the astrological world is understanding how someone else's astrology works and what they're bringing to the table, and how that's going to interact with what you're bringing to the table. You can totally not use astrology and just figure these things out as they come. There's no problem with doing that. There's no problem with situations coming up and learning from them in the moment. But astrology is a good roadmap to see where those potholes and dangerous roads or territories are going to be, so that they don't take your wheel off unexpectedly. It's not like you're going to die, right, if you get a flat tire. But knowing, oh, I can avoid a flat tire on this road if I stay to the left because there's construction going on, versus just happening upon the construction. Another good place to look in terms of all of this astrology combined with conflict resolution is at your moon placement, because that's going to tell you about yours or another's emotional state and how the tools you deploy for conflict resolution might affect the other person. So this is where we start to get into the empathy component, right? Because as Matt mentioned, we all have varying degrees of empathy. Some people are highly empathetic and can just naturally deploy that. Others of us, it takes some learning and some effort and some mindfulness to say, okay, I really got to practice being empathetic here. So this is going to help you sharpen that tool in your tool belt a little bit better, because I believe that empathy is a really, really awesome, powerful tool, and it might be the most powerful one you have. Matt's got a moon in Libra, and that means that he's able to balance and rationalize things and feelings that people send his way. Because Libra is an air sign, it means that Matt approaches like feelings and emotional state in an intelligent and conversational way. He likes to discuss what he's feeling, likes to know and put into words what the other person is feeling. He likes to have his emotional scape organized. For me, I've got a moon in Scorpio. So saying something hurtful to me, maybe even if it comes from a good place, might trigger or hurt me really deeply. And you may not know that, because I'm prone to internalizing it. And I also might be a little intimidating toward you if you hurt me, because it's like poking a sleeping scorpion, right? The scorpion's naturally going to be on guard, have that stinger up, is ready to deploy poison if need be. I'm just naturally more private. And so sharing those things and putting into words what I'm feeling doesn't come naturally to me. As Scorpio is a water sign, I'm just feeling it. And I'm a little bit at mercy of just feeling the feelings as they're coming. And sometimes they're so deep and indescribable that I have a hard time verbalizing it. Knowing what emotional scape I'm working with and what emotional scape Matt is working with, we see again, right, these two sides of a little bit of a spectrum that are created in the friendship that we've cultivated, and finding a middle ground that makes us both comfortable to say, okay, how can you verbalize what you're feeling? Because I can't always feel what you're feeling. And how can I help you, Matt, drop into some of that feeling to understand on an empathetic level what it is I'm experiencing? And the only way that I can do that, because you can't jump into my body and feel my feelings, is by using my words, which I'm not always good at. And I'm so thankful I got you as a friend, because you helped me verbalize some of that emotional turmoil that for a long time just overtook me.
I think we've specifically used the phrase use your words before. So that rings true.
Definitely.
I always like listening to when you lay out like who you and I are as people. And I think most of the time, maybe 75 to 85% of the time, I love what you say about me as a person from an astrology perspective. And I think this one really does actually give some insights and things to be mindful of about me as a person. And just like quick aside, Aries is one of my favorite Greek gods. I don't really know why, but he is. But when we were talking about the four horsemen, we mentioned some specific tips, but that in general, being mindful of these as potential defense mechanisms that we may fall on that wouldn't be good to use, being mindful is the way around it. Is that what our astrology is in this case? Or are there specific things that we should be doing to combat some of the maybe more negative qualities or approach conflict resolution from an effective place?
Everyone's working with different astrology. So knowing what you're working with and knowing where you naturally fall and what horseman you might be prone to based on what you've got going on is a really effective way to then say, okay, I understand that, like, okay, me as an Aries person, they are direct and tell it like it is, which for somebody who, like a Cancer or a water sign, receiving that fire is going to be maybe unintentionally hurtful to them. It's going to be hard to hear. So knowing that your directness can sometimes be seen as other people who are more sensitive as criticism, knowing where that lies for you, knowing if you do fall into, yeah, I do get a little bit critical, even though what I'm saying is true, but it's also hurting somebody else. It's not an effective tool in us coming to a resolution here. Knowing that can be so helpful to say, okay, that's how I naturally act. I can watch for situations where that's happening. I can ask people around me who I trust to say, hey, let me know if I'm being a little bit too direct with you, because I want to be more empathetic to other people, whatever it is. So there are things that we're just naturally going to be more prone to. I think it's important to know what those are so you can decide whether you want to be that or not, whether you want to be that horseman or whether you want to be the one fighting the horseman or not. Astrology is a really effective tool to do that. You know, the other way I think around it is you just naturally experience like lots of times where people are like, man, like you really hurt my feelings, or man, you're really direct, or like, dang, that was really rude. And over time saying, okay, like what does that mean? And then you've gathered enough of those experiences that maybe even have hurt you to say, okay, I'm dealing with the fact that I am very critical, versus this is just a layout of, hey, you're prone to being a little bit critical and deciding, choosing your own adventure. Do you want to venture down that path and see where that gets you? Because there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with where you naturally are. Or do you want to make a different choice? It all just depends on the person that you are cultivating, the person that you want to be.
I think that the nugget that I'm pulling from that is that the key is understand your astrology and the astrology of the person that you are in conflict with, to either have the empathy to know how they're going to interpret things that you're saying, or kind of head things off at the pass that might become an issue during the conflict resolution. Does that seem like an accurate summary, or?
Yeah, I would say it's knowing how the person across from you is going to come at you, and how you coming at them is going to make them feel, and you understanding how you naturally come at situations and how you are naturally prone to feeling. It's both. It's understanding you and them. And
Yeah.
as I always
Okay.
say, start with you. Start with you. Start there. Just start with how you assert yourself and how you feel when, I guess, you are asserted over. And start there. This week's tarot card is the Five of Swords. This card is about winning, about self-interest, conquest, and survival mode. The need to be right is strong, which is causing you to push harder than you normally do or would around something. And the moon in Aries is also driving that harder right now. You don't want to lose control, which is inflating your ego. You're trying to protect yourself from being embarrassed or wrong or hurt. But because the ego hates being embarrassed or wrong or hurt. But what's the point of winning if in the process you alienate those closest to you? You may have won the argument, you may be totally in the right, but you sacrificed a good relationship in the process. Ask yourself, is it really worth hurting others to get what you want?
What a perfect card for today. And I think that it segues really well into the psychological wellness tip. This week, I want you to be mindful about taking small breaks throughout the day. We work hard, and in doing so, we can potentially take an emotional mortgage of putting off feelings until later. We'll pay for it later. So the bank comes calling later on, and we can misattribute negative feelings because we didn't acknowledge their existence before. So a frustrating situation at work then becomes you being angry at home with your partner or your dog or children or whoever else may be there. Not every negative feeling needs to become a conflict, but taking these small breaks throughout the day can help you pay off that mortgage in smaller chunks. And the mortgage analogy went a little farther than I thought I was going to, but the general idea here is we can take that small amount of time to acknowledge the emotions in smaller portions, and then we don't ever have to have this huge load driving home from work or as we get ready for bed at night or anything like that.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Full Circle, the Magic Mindset Podcast. If you want to learn more about us or hear previous episodes, you can visit lealily.com/Full Circle Podcast. There you can find previous episodes and also our show notes where we include previous tarot polls, links, and more extras from each of our episodes. You can also engage with us on Twitter at @fullcircle_POD. And we also have a community on Facebook under Full Circle, the Magic Mindset Podcast, where we hope to communicate and talk with you. You can share your insights, your thoughts on our themes, and more in that community. If you want to listen to more of our episodes, we are on Spotify and iTunes, and also on my website. We release new episodes every Monday. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week.